Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. I'm Luke Corbin. It's July 3rd, 2017, and today we're speaking with Dr. Jonathan Saha, Associate Professor of Southeast Asian History at the University of Leeds and author of the Colonising Animals website with its beastly bibliography. Jonathan is a well-known historian of colonial Burma who in 2013 published the excellent book Law, Disorder and the Colonial State, Corruption in Burma, circa 1900. More recently, Jonathan has become engaged in what anthropologists call the interspecies turn and has been publishing prolifically on the animal history of Burma. And that will be the theme of our chat today. Hello, Jonathan.
Hello, Luke. Thank you very much for coming and talking to me.
It's my pleasure. It's great to be in Leeds. Okay, so you argue that the divide between humans and animals cannot be captured and fixed in language or in space and time. It's subject to change and is redefined in new historical circumstances. So what can paying attention to animals tell us about the past, and why is this important for the future? And what is it about Burma that's particularly interesting for animal history?
Well, I think one of the things that looking at the history of animals tells us, particularly because the definition of them is so slippery, as you were suggesting there.
I think for animals.
Is it gives you a sense of what it is precisely people mean when they talk about humans. And a lot of the work carried by animals is important for the other types of exclusions that exist. So when people are writing about animals, writing natural history, the types of traits that they assume are natural or innate to those animals are often ways of also making other humans closer to animals, or other types of human traits also innate and unquestionable. So the denial of language to animals, the assumption that animals don't have forms of language, makes the idea of humans speaking an innately human trait, a defining feature of humans. But that means if you get humans who don't speak languages that you recognise as languages, or humans who can't speak at all, their status as humans also becomes questioned and becomes problematic. So, yeah, you see this in history in a variety of ways, but it's particularly connected often with colonialism, as Europeans and European philosophical ideas of what constitutes a human and what constitutes an animal comes into conflict with cultures that they struggle to reconcile with their own categories. So when they come across languages which they don't feel are really languages in the same way as European languages are languages, they become closer to animals. They become less human. So looking at the relationship between definitions of animals and definitions of colonialism, I guess, was one of the things that got me interested. Burma is particularly interesting because I find it interesting to an extent. I guess the reason I stuck with looking at Myanmar is because I have these research connections with the place. But it's also a commitment to the point that a lot of animal history is centred in Europe or North America. And this belief that if you're writing the history of something as big as a topic like that, as something as abstractly important as a topic like that, then you have to go to what they define as the sort of centres of a lot of this thought. If you're trying to make the argument that colonialism is central to that, but also you don't want to reproduce that sort of colonial power relationship which establishes the global south as the centre, then it's really interesting to locate your study within a particular place and the richness and complexity of that culture itself. So what I find interesting in my current work is to locate those colonial understandings of animals and the implicit racial and gender ideologies that are there within pre-existing Burmese Buddhist notions of what animals are and how humans relate to them and how humans are different or similar to them. And also to look at how Burmese actors were engaging with those sort of European-derived ideas, changing them and altering them in their own contexts. And that is important because otherwise you get the implicit idea that ideas coming out of Europe, powerful philosophical ideas coming out of Europe, say like evolution, are sort of disseminated around the world and just land there and take roots, rather than understanding that it was a process of understanding and appropriation and creative engagement that led to these ideas spreading around the world, and that it's not just European colonial actors who are important in that process.
Yeah, okay, that's great. That's a great explanation. But also, Burma has elephants.
It does have elephants, yeah, no, exactly, which makes it a great place to look at.
I think that you've phrased it once that you're interested in looking at the invention of the Burmese elephant. What does that mean?
Well, I meant it in two senses. One, and relating to the two parts of the phrase, I mean, how does an elephant become Burmese? And partly that is about defining a place according to its natural history. So there's a process through which exploring and finding out about animals and imagining a particular place to be home to a particular set of indigenous, sorry I did in air quotes there, indigenous species, is an intrinsic part of imagining the geography of Burma as a place. Mm-hmm. So the Burmese part of it is invented. But the elephant part of it is also invented in the sense that what an elephant means to people in Burma historically is hugely contingent upon the culture, upon the history of that place. And also that the knowledge built out of colonial experience and alongside centuries of working alongside animals in Burma has contributed greatly to the wider understandings of the elephant that have become embedded in scientific knowledge around the world. So the invention happens two ways. One, a very specific way that geographically the elephant becomes imagined as Burmese, but the other way as well, the way that the particular relationships with the elephant in Burma has contributed to a wider normative understanding of what an elephant is.
Oh, okay, good. And on elephants, you use one example in one of your publications thinking about elephant riders or Uzis. So let's talk about that. You've written there that British writers have long been intrigued but disgusted by what they deem to be inappropriate interactions with animals in Burma. Yet they also perceive these relationships with animals as more harmonious than their own. So what is that all about, and what does touch and even breastfeeding have to do with it?
Yeah, so breastfeeding is one of the practices which they, at least in their writings, wrote very strongly of how much they were disgusted by this. And it was the repeated stories of Burmese women breastfeeding orphaned animals, some of which is about a particular representation of Buddhism, in which Burmese Buddhism is thought to be overly sympathetic to animals and not have sufficient distance between humans and animals, which is a point repeatedly made in 19th century writings about Burmese religion and religious practices. So that's part of what's going on there, a way of differentiating the British from the Burmese through their religious beliefs and as a result through their relationships with animals. But at the same time, those descriptions of particularly Burmese women breastfeeding royal elephants are a deliberate attempt to titillate a British audience as they read it. So there's a sort of exoticization of the colony for those readers. So that's part of what's going on there, a form of differentiation and a way of also creating a particular type of Orientalist image, if you like. So that's part of what's going on with the politics of disgust. The way in which Uzis are written about and the way that it's seen to be very harmonious, very romantic view of it, I think is a really interesting one. I mean, you get two types of writings. You either get writers who are very denigrating of Burmese Uzis, saying that they are neglectful, that they're superstitious, that they are effectively abusing their animals with their ignorance of rational medical understandings, Western biomedical understandings. Then you get the sets of writings that are more numerous, that are just a very romantic portrayal. You have the idea that teenage Uzi, having been in the profession for generations, is paired up with a teenage elephant of about the same age. They learn to work with one another, and they work with each other for the rest of their lives, and they have a special relationship where they can communicate in a way which no one else can. Uzi will play music to them, and the elephant will play tricks on their Uzi, and that type of relationship is presented there. Now, I don't want to sort of eliminate the thought that there are any form of emotional connections between Uzis and elephants. I mean, there clearly are. But the work that these particularly colonial writings on that is doing is something quite different. And it's a very like a noble savage type of image, that these people are one with nature, and so they're closer to nature. So that's part of what's going on there. And that reestablishes a hierarchy again, just as well as writings have discussed do. There's a difference. They access a world of nature that we can't access anymore as Europeans, is what the colonial writers are saying there.
And their supple white legs can't handle the elephant hair.
That's right, yeah. No, their skin is far too sensitive. And there's some really interesting stuff about sensitive skin beyond that. The idea that the elephant itself has sensitive skin, that it's subject to heat stroke and sunstroke in a way that it's often not recognised that Burmese people could be. So there's that sort of higher animal thing going on there. There's also some fascinating stuff about white elephants, and how the white elephants which were sent to Britain in the late 19th century weren't seen to be white enough, which caused this anxiety about skin pigmentation and all sorts of stuff like that. So yeah, I think it's just one of those ways, again, it illustrates how writings about particular animals very quickly spills over into discussions of human differentiation and the politics of social hierarchies. Whilst the British were writing about the Burmese in these sort of denigrating or ways in which made them seem very romanticised in their relationships with nature, it served to mask their own very close relationships with animals. And the British themselves were emotionally attached to their pet dogs, often to some of the elephants which they interacted with as well. And they were also very physically close to animals. Sometimes they wanted to be, sometimes they didn't. And sometimes those sort of emotional connections and physical connections with their dogs led them to being closer to species they didn't want to be very close to, like fleas and ticks. So there's a whole history of the physical relationship that the British had with Burmese wildlife, taking pets like tapirs and bears as well into their homes, that undercuts the idea that the Burmese were different for their special, close, overly sympathetic relationship with animals. Actually, what's going on here is a very complex and hypocritical sometimes negotiating of which animals who some people could be with and which animals other people couldn't be with, or that type of politics going on.
All right, so let's go back to this mention of milk. Here we are sitting in England drinking tea. I'm drinking it with milk. Some scholars see the global history of cow's milk as the triumphant emergence of a culturally malleable universal commodity. Your own research into cows and dairy in Burma, however, reveals some of the limits to that idea. So what was the milk line, and what was milk all about in colonial Burma, and why? And when we talk about milk, Should we be mindful of keeping the producer, the cow, in the picture?
It's another great set of questions. The milk line was a geographical notion that when you got over what is pretty much the contemporary border between Myanmar and Bangladesh, milk consumption stopped or pretty much fell off. And anthropologists during the early 20th century and into the mid 20th century were really interested in what that connoted, what that shift, that apparent change was about. And those discussions really mapped onto a wider imperial idea of Southeast Asia as a place apart from India and China in particular. And understanding the pockets of milk drinking that operated, or the little milking habits of, say, using milk at shrines. These things were seen as sort of remnants of a Hindu culture that was once present and had declined and disappeared. So it's a way of, well, it was bound up with the notion of Southeast Asia as a place which lacked its own true independent culture in some ways. So a lot was riding on that, what may seem on the surface quite banal observation that more milk was drunk on one side of a border than the other side. What makes Burma particularly interesting about that is that that border is by no means natural or given, and is historically exceptionally fluid and remains so to today, and that cultural practices and exchanges were often rooted in that region and Rakhine, and so that whole region is much more complex than that story would allow for. It gives a sense of a pure break when that pure break doesn't really exist. So looking at milk drinking in Burma opens up a question of how does a particular dietary practice become a question of colonial mapping? And one of the ways it does is through the producer, the cow itself. And the concern in colonial Burma is that the types of animals which are being used to produce milk are a danger to the cattle that are there to help produce rice. And that's because the milking cattle mostly come from India, and the plough cattle are for the most part indigenous to Burma, or more accurately bred in the upland areas between Burma and Siam. So this particular concern is one that maps surprisingly, or perhaps not so surprisingly, contemporaneous or coterminous concerns with the Indian human population, who are seen to be moving in unruly ways and uncontrollable ways, and bringing with them disease, and also a practice of promiscuity and interbreeding. So the fear was that the Indian cattle would mix breed with the Burmese cattle and result in a less powerful, less resilient form of cattle, which would be less good for ploughing the fields. That the Indian humans looking after this milking cattle weren't reliable enough to keep all their cattle in one place. It would get diseased, it would wander off, they would die in fields, and they would spread that disease to the Burmese cattle. And so they tried to put restrictions on the movement of Indian cattle that fall in line with the same times in which they try and put restrictions on the movement of Indian people. So, yeah, you've got the Indian milking cattle standing in for a lot. The idea of it being non-indigenous is the idea that there is a distinctive breed between the two. And whilst there were physical changes and transformations that happened through sort of ecological niches in which these species had developed, they are the same species. The Bos indicus, they're not different in that sense. So the differences between them are really quite superficial and have to be drawn out. So there's a parallel with racial discourses as well. The idea that there are meaningful bodily differences between these two entities that have a resulting set of biological effects, beyond just being, quite mundane, descriptive differences between the two. So there's quite a lot in there.
What I was thinking about with milk, I'm quite interested in the concerns the British had and their efforts in colonial Burma about measuring the adulteration of alcohol and alcoholic drinks, and that was heavily discriminatory the way that was done. Were there similar concerns about milk? Was milk adulterated after it came out of the cow, and was that a concern?
Yes, it was a huge concern. Huge concern. And there were, again, that was racialized. The concern was particularly around Indian producers and how they themselves were unclean. So not just deliberate contamination, but the idea that the uncleanly Indian was a repeated sort of figure of concern in a lot of these reports. So that's part of it. But there's also an interesting concern with the makeup of milk itself as an object. It's going through a period of change in the late 19th century, early 20th century, whereas it becomes associated with particular types of diseases. So tuberculosis gets linked with milk in a particular way. But at the same time, it's deemed to be a very healthy entity. It's something that is almost essential to health in a lot of the thinking of this time. So that it's being analysed for things like its fat content, which species produce the best fat content. Should you be trying to get people not to actually use oxen, but to be looking instead at buffalo because it has a higher fat content? So there's all these sort of questions about that, as well as about the conditions in which the animals themselves live in and whether that produces negative health effects. So it would be interesting to look at it alongside something like alcohol production, where there are some sort of health effects associated with it, with tonics and all sorts of things like that. But at least my superficial understanding would be that it gets detached somewhat from those notions of alcohol as a health improving drink, whereas milk becomes increasingly attached to its healthy properties and detached from its being a vector of disease. There's concern about people not drinking enough milk, but there's also a huge concern that milk itself is not healthy.
Okay, that's great. We've gone all over the place. I love it. So you're talking with people at the moment about milk. What other projects are you currently working on? Are you planning on taking all your animal history stuff, because you've done quite a lot now, and putting that into a book?
Yeah, I am, and I had a bit of a bash at writing a introduction chapter to what a book might look like to try and get some ideas together. The problem is an interspecies book is really tricky. How do you put together a book that takes into account the very different types of human-animal interactions going on in a colony as diverse and as complex as British Burma was? Is it feasible to have, say, silkworms captured in the same chapter as timber elephants? Are they working animals in quite the same way? Are there concepts that can capture those real, unbridgeable almost species differences? So thinking about how that might work, how might that operate, is it's a fun challenge. I'm quite enjoying it, but it's also tricky. The format in which a lot of my history has been written in the past has often been through micro-historical case studies of individuals or events, and building a sort of layered history of those that eventually speaks to much broader, sometimes even global shifts and changes. What this work seems to be pushing me to do is almost a quite different direction of looking again at smaller histories, but keeping those smaller histories small in a sense, and then looking for the abstract things that connect a series of small histories. So rather than having one story telling a bigger story, what I think is I have a series of often very species-specific little stories that added together might tell us something a bit more abstract. But we'll see. What I'm interested in currently, much more narrowly, I guess, is looking at some of the writings of Thakin Kodalmine, who was a Burmese nationalist poet, literary figure in the interwar years, and through into the post-independence period as well. Very important figure, who amongst his huge corpus of writings wrote a number of tika, or sort of religious commentaries about animals. And these are huge texts. They run often into well over 200 pages. And they involve Burmese folk stories, Jataka tales, all sorts of stuff like that. But also, alongside of that, incorporating sort of natural history knowledge into them as well, drawing quite widely on European scientific writings. And it's the combination of all those things in one type of text that takes the form of a longer indigenous text, or an indigenous form, if you like, and that is, I think, so interesting and so useful for opening out animal history to other types of practices, other types of understandings, away from the more Eurocentric approach that has generally been the case so far. The problem is they're really, really difficult texts to read.
I was just thinking.
Very, very difficult texts to read. So what I've been focusing on at the minute is a section at the back of the Meow Tika, the monkey tika, that is just called the monkey section, which you would have thought in a book entirely devoted to monkeys would be superfluous, but nonetheless it's there. And what is great about this is it's the bit where he breaks it down into a species by species paragraph about monkeys, different monkeys and apes. So he'll have a little bit about a gorilla, he'll have a little bit about chimpanzee, and he goes through each one. And some of the material in there is derived from natural history texts, some of it is anecdotal, some of it is making sort of satirical political points about the nature of colonialism and Burmese mimicry of British ways. It's a fascinating little insight into some of those negotiations, because I don't feel I've got the expertise to do full justice to the text as a whole. What I'm hoping is that it'll shed light on anti-colonial thinkers who could be also thought of as useful thinkers for thinking about how animals themselves were conceptualized. So encourage more people out there to look at the writings of Burmese nationalists, or African nationalists, and people in other contexts who are also thinking about animals in this context in profoundly interesting ways. And if I can only get through the monkey section of the Monkey Tika, hopefully it'll be a useful sort of prod to other scholars. I can't see myself getting more than anything that is a prod and an indication.
Okay, we're running out of time, so every guest is always given the opportunity to issue a recommendation to all the listeners, something to do with Myanmar. It can be anything you like. Do you have anything?
Well, I feel like I should probably recommend something animal related. So a place where I had one of the most lovely days, I think, of my life, and had a really important learning experience, is the Green Hill Valley Elephant Sanctuary up near Kalor. And it's a wonderful part of Burma, just stunning there in the southern Shan states. They've got a number of, I think 5 or 6 now, retired working elephants that used to work for for various logging firms and are now living the life of luxury in their retired state, but they deserve. And the people who run it up there do a fantastic job of looking after both the animals and the Uzis who go there with them and are in this lovely situation where they're now looking after them. They're also replanting some of the teak forest there, and you just get a great day out to experience what are quite incredible species that we share a hell of a lot in common with. So yeah, I think that would be my recommendation. There's also a number of photographs from the colonial period that are now residing there and showing what the timber industry used to be like back in the 1930s. And you might see some surprising contemporary comparisons. So yeah, that's what I'd recommend.
Okay. Thank you so much for inviting me into your lovely office in Leeds and letting me do this podcast with you. I really appreciate it.
Absolute pleasure.